Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim, here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I hope everyone out there who's listening, they're doing as fantastic as myself. I always love bringing these conversations back around with updates. We speak about these disappearances or these cold cases, and most of the time, hey, they're cold, so there's the definition there. We hardly have an answer when we're done speaking about it the first time around, so it's always great to get updates and have old friends bring new friends on who have joined in the conversation. But Tim, part of the conversation is how you're doing. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, I am excited to introduce this conversation that we had with James Wolner and Lisa Jo. And they are both working diligently to find Barbara Cotton. Barbara Cotton has been missing from Williston, North Dakota since April 11th, 1981. She was 15 years old at the time of her disappearance, 5'2", about 100 pounds, and was wearing a blouse, jeans, and loafers, brown hair, and hazel eyes. James does a podcast called Dakota Spotlight, and that show dug really deep into Barb's case, and that is how he and Lisa Jo met. And since that podcast started working on Barbara's case, Lisa Jo has really helped with research, and she runs the findbarbcotton.com website, and it's really a very informative website. And so Lisa Jo joins James in this conversation. We did previously speak with James about Barb's disappearance about 2 years ago. So check that one out if you haven't already. It was the most recent episode here on Missing, and this one kind of picks up where the last one left off.
And anyone with information on Barbara Cotton is instructed to contact the Williston Police Department at 701-577-1212. You can also email Lisa Jo at findbarbcotton.com, and that's findbarbcotton@gmail.com.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here, and we'll be right back with Lisa Jo and James. Thanks a lot for listening. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa Jo and James. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back. My second time here, Lisa's first time. So thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. We always like inviting guests back to give us some updates on these stories that come our way, because that's sort of the whole thing, right? You have these stories that come up, you get involved emotionally, personally, you do a lot of work, and you go on and you talk about it for like an hour, and you want to make sure that you can come back and have updates. So welcome back, James. And for the first time, Lisa, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So how is it that you two know each other?
You know, I started this season 5 of my podcast, Dakota Spotlight, about missing Barbara Cotton, and I had to re-listen to it here yesterday. It's 20 episodes, actually. After about 5 episodes, I started getting a lot of, I have a Facebook group, and Lisa Jo started, just saw her name more and more. And next thing I know, she's related to missing Barbara Cotton. So, I'll let her introduce herself more, but she just started helping me basically with a lot of the research, and has now spearheaded Find Barb Cotton, a movement to find Barb Cotton. So I kind of started, I guess you could say, with the podcast, this movement, and she's been holding the torch here for the last few years. So how would you describe it all, Lisa Jo?
Like I kind of inserted myself, actually.
No, it's all good.
So I do genealogy, and obviously I'm an extended family member of Barb's. I'm actually, my ex-husband, Barb was his aunt. So very extended, but we're still close. And I do a lot of genealogy, and that's just kind of been my hobby for a long time. And when the podcast started up, I was super excited because this is a case that's always bothered me, obviously. As James was going through the first few episodes, I started to follow along, and I'm researching on the side. And then, I'm sending him things like, hey, I found this, It was the episode before you had released Stacy Werder's name. And I had found the article detailing what happened to him. And I sent it to you and you're like, oh my God, how'd you find that? And you were like, please wait till the next episode to share that.
Yeah.
And yeah, from there, I think you kind of asked me if I wouldn't mind looking into another person. And then I don't know how I ended up here.
No, but she's been amazing resource. Well, yeah, you guys know how it goes. You start on the story and people start to offer help. And Lisa Jo's she's just a dogged researcher. We can talk later about how she found a friend she mentioned Stacy Werder. He's a person of interest in this case. And she's just been a great resource. And like I said, she's holding the torch at this point. I've moved on to, I just wrapped up season 9 of Dakota Spotlight. Meanwhile, she is just, dedicated to the Barb Cotton story.
And Barbara Cotton disappeared in 1981. So this is not a recent story. This is a story that is cold as cold comes. Not a whole lot to go on. You did say that there was a person of interest, but Lisa Jo, you said that you're a distant relation of Barbara. Can you give us a little bit of a background on Barbara, just to refresh the listeners' memories?
Barbara came from a large family. My ex-mother-in-law was an older sister. There's older siblings in the family. Her mom was a single mom, so the kids had to kind of grow up fast. There was older siblings, but they were adults. They were out with, their own families and things. So it was basically just her younger sister, and her brother that was a year older, and then their mom. And their mom worked a lot to make ends meet. Barb was 15 when she disappeared in 1981. Sounds like a typical teenager. Very well liked. And she was very sweet. Maybe almost naive in some things. Gave people a little too much credit, maybe. Loved animals. She was starting to dabble into going to parties and things like that, which her mother was not happy about. So there was some risk factors there, but nothing I wouldn't consider atypical for a teenager, some teenagers at least.
And she was 15 at the time of her disappearance. Can you talk about the circumstances of her disappearance?
I mean, I could try. We don't know much for sure. The typical story that you hear is that Barb went to dinner with her boyfriend and another friend, and her boyfriend watched her walk into Recreation Park, and she was never seen again. And maybe I'll let James talk about how, the reasons that we believe that might not necessarily be true.
I first found out about this case from the North Dakota Attorney General's website. Have a list of missing person, and it was that very scenario. It says Barbara Cotton was seen by her boyfriend, parted ways with her boyfriend downtown Williston, North Dakota. She walks into this park on her way home. He watched her as far as into the park, and at that point she's 3 or 4 blocks from home, and she's never seen again. And then I start looking into this, and turns out this boyfriend, this official narrative of what happened, gets very interesting because none of Barbara's friends know about this boyfriend. So the Attorney General website states this, last name with her boyfriend. And then when I start getting into it, it turns out none of her friends know about this boyfriend. Some of her best friends said she didn't have a boyfriend. Who is this boyfriend? And yet it's Barbara's mother called in the missing persons report the next day, right, Lisa Jo, and said she was last seen with a guy named Stacy. I mean, if we fast forward a little bit, we tried to get confirmed from law enforcement that they ever talked to this guy, Stacy, and we're not sure they ever did. So as far as we know, this version, Barbara walking into the park in Williston, is just coming from this one person who was potentially never interviewed.
Even her siblings didn't know about Stacy. Her best friend didn't know about Stacy. Stacy obviously being the boyfriend.
But there's also a lot. I'm sorry for interrupting. There's a lot of discussion about, was he actually a boyfriend or just a friend.
Or did she know him at all?
It's just very, very surreal.
And how old was Stacy at that time?
21.
Okay, so that's a pretty big age gap, especially for Barbara when she's 15.
Yep.
Yeah, and he was a drifter. The only person who can place Stacy and Barbara together in Williston, I believe, is Barbara's mother. Correct, Lisa Jo?
Definitively, yes. There were other people that Barb was with a guy and they felt it could have been Stacy. But they weren't positive, and after this long, they weren't willing to say for sure it was him. But from their memory, now looking back, they feel like it's possible it was him.
And when you say drifter, was this somebody who just sort of drifted into town and no one had seen him before? He didn't go to the high school and he didn't have like a job at one of the local establishments. He just sort of came into town and somehow connected with Barbara?
That's what we think. And he did have a job for a while, which is that job that a drifter can get, which he washed dishes at a restaurant in Williston. Apparently, when Barbara's mother called the police, she said she saw him with this guy who used to wash dishes at this restaurant called Cakes and Cones in Williston. And how long he'd been in Williston, how they met, we don't know. But Barbara did work as either a waitress or bus person at a restaurant, I believe, at a cafe. So if you're bussing tables at a cafe, you're pretty likely to run into a dishwasher, a person who washes dishes. And it's possible they met that way, but we're not sure. So, but yeah, he was basically a drifter. And through the podcast, I end up speaking to Stacy's sisters out in California. And they told us that, yeah, he was a drifter. He went all over the country. So
he was a drifter by choice.
Yes.
Stacy didn't drive either. He hitchhiked everywhere. He didn't have a driver's license, at least to his sister's knowledge. He didn't drive at all. This wasn't his first time drifting. He would go and he would come back. He was from California. They recalled that one of their brothers had gone with him once and they were in Canada even. He had at least gone out drifting a few times this way, and to their knowledge, it wasn't him driving. He just picked up rides.
And on our last conversation, James, a couple of years ago, was it true, did I hear this correctly, that Barbara was seen with him at a party, was seen with Stacy that night or shortly before she went missing?
So that was a really interesting thing with this. I got an interview with a current present-day detective at Williston PD, who is one of a couple or two or three who work on this case when they have time, and they say they have boxes and boxes of material. And she shared with us that Barbara's mother told the police back then that a friend of Barbara's was with Barbara later at a party. So we have this official version of the last, it's interesting, the official version online was, including the Attorney General's website, was she was last seen walking into this park. But then we learned directly from law enforcement, well, actually later she was at a party. Have we confirmed that was later, Lisa Jo, or could it have been before?
It sounded like law enforcement wasn't really sure. I know they had said that they had tried to reach out, I think it was, to the people that they felt had the party or the friend. And they weren't exactly sure if the party had occurred either, or if it was just a couple people hanging out at somebody's apartment, or, a big house party where a lot of people should have seen Barb. They weren't sure about much with it. And then we did get in contact with a couple of sisters. They used to have house parties back then, and they know that Barb had at least came to one of their parties recently. They are hesitant to say that it was 100% positively that night, though they both do believe it was the night that she disappeared. And that's what I was mentioning earlier, that she was with a guy. And, after 40 plus years, it could have been Stacy. They think it could have been, but they aren't positive, and they don't want to give anybody the impression that they are positive, which I appreciate a lot. That, I hate when people repeat things like they're factual and you find out that they're not true. So I'd rather somebody let me know if they aren't positive and I can act accordingly. It's all a mess.
Complicating matters. Stacy committed suicide not long after. Is that correct?
Yeah. It goes like this, I guess. Again, some of this we got from law enforcement. Barbara's mother calls them back the next day. She reports them missing the day after and then calls them back on Monday and says she thinks Barbara might be in Scobie, Montana, in this hotel, the Pioneer Hotel in Scobie, Montana. She has a room number even. And we don't know why, to this day, we don't know where she got this information. Or we don't, maybe law enforcement does. The only thing we know is that there's a note in her file that some local law enforcement went there and the girl, quote, the girl is not there, unquote. We don't know if Stacy was there, if anyone was there, but the girl was not there. And it's just weird. We cannot figure out, why does she think Barbara's up there? And you'll have to remind me now, Lisa Jo, because it's been a while. Does Louise, Barbara's mother, say she thinks she's with Stacy up in Scobie?
Yes, I think she did. I think she did, now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Let's see. So then Stacy ends up in jail in Glasgow, Montana for a week or so.
What was that for?
We think it was some kind of, his sisters told me that he was in some kind of fight or he got jumped or something. There was some kind of brawl.
I think the official arrest was disorderly conduct, though.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
but we do think that there's a background story there that his sisters were aware of.
After he gets out of jail in Glasgow, he ends up in a town called Malta, which is further west, I don't know, 100 miles or 60 miles. He's probably hitchhiking. And there he gets arrested for disorderly conduct again at a movie theater. And they arrest him and they put him in jail for the night. And the next morning they discover that he's hanged himself using the legs, like his overalls they gave him for jail. He somehow took the pant leg, tied it together, and hung himself in jail. And I ended up petitioning. I thought, well, let's get more information about that. There was an inquest done by the coroner, or they wanted to be sure that it was actually suicide. There was actually an inquest. I had to petition the county up there, and it took months before I got the documentation. And that's when we discovered we got really excited because we had heard that Stacy was hanging out with a guy named Red, and that's all we had was his nickname. And I don't think this had happened when I was on with you guys last time. And sure enough, in this coroner's inquest, there's this, it's kind of almost like a little trial where they're interviewing law enforcement, and it's all transcribed. And I'm reading here, and they're asking, the sheriff who arrested Stacy, was he with anyone? Oh, yes, he was with Red Sullivan. That's when I called Lisa Jo, oh my God, we found Red. We found someone who was with Stacy at the time he died. We didn't know, could this guy Red have also, if Stacy was involved, co-conspirator, or did maybe Stacy confess to him? What information does this guy Red have? And so we got super excited because, as I said, we only had a nickname, Red, and how are you going to find a Red, And all of a sudden we had his name. And that's when Lisa Jo's research capabilities really kind of, impressed me, because it wasn't that long. I'll let her tell the story herself, but she found Red.
Oh, it's never that easy, right? You find the name, it's never that easy.
It was just a quick Google search, right?
Oh, God. No.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So we had no idea. We knew he was in Malta at that point in time. By the time they were having this inquest, he was not still in town. We had known previously from Stacy's sisters that he actually brought Stacy's belongings out to California to his mother. And they knew that he had been arrested at some point afterwards for something like burglary, armed robbery, something like that. It was him and a couple other guys that had came out there. And it was kind of a dead end. It's like you're looking for a guy that obviously traveled quite a bit named Red until the inquest. And then we had a last name and we had the initials. And, I'm thinking, oh, we got him. Here we go. Oh, no, absolutely not. It actually, we looked very hard and then we still could not find him. And what it actually took, so it was more of a stroke of luck probably than my research abilities, but somebody actually commented on the Facebook story about it and said that they lived in Malta and that when they were growing up, there was a couple brothers there named, and she listed off Red's name and also his brother's name. And I was like, okay, so then using the full first name that she gave me, then I was able to, track him, I think Florida, where he had been arrested for it was not armed robbery. It was, he had broken into a church. He was hungry. So it was much less of an offense than what they had remembered. And from there, we were able to track him, to other states and things where we eventually found him.
He didn't want to be found in the first place.
No.
By anybody. Lisa Jo finds his address somehow. I think he had been petitioning Florida to get this felony removed from his record from breaking into this church. So we found, the open records. There was an address or something, which leads to a pastor somewhere. I don't even remember what state, but it was in the South. And I end up calling this pastor and asking if there's a Red there. And he says, well, he lives in he rents out like a little cabin and he lives there. He doesn't have a phone or anything. And as a true crime, you guys can imagine, like, oh my God, it's like Unabomber, right? We found he doesn't have a phone. This is this is a hot lead. And I talked to the pastor asked me why, and I just walked him through the whole thing. Barbara Cotton disappeared. She was last seen with the guy who committed suicide in Malta, Montana, in 1981, and Red was with him, and we just want to know if he has any information. And he's like, wow. Another pastor comes over like the next day, and they call Red over. He tells us this story in my podcast when Lisa Jo and I talked to him in one of the episodes, and he said, they called me over there and said, we're going to have a meeting. And he says, they start reading me something about a missing girl. And then they say the name Stacy Werder, and he says, did you say Stacy Werder? I haven't heard this guy's name since forever. How do you, for him, it was so surreal. And long story short, well, I'll let Lisa Jo tell everyone what Red had to say, what we found out.
Yeah. So when we went into this, we're thinking maybe he was with Stacy in Williston. Maybe Stacy must have said something to him. He ran all this stuff out to Stacy's mom. They must have been great friends, But actually, as it turns out, he actually just picked Stacy up hitchhiking. He was from Malta, and he was back in town. He was waiting for some sort of check or money for something to come in for him. So he was back in Malta and he had seen Stacy hitchhiking. He picked him up. They actually camped together for like a week while Red was out there waiting for, this check to come in for him. And he said he was quiet, but nothing weird about him. He didn't have any extreme angry outbursts or anything in that week while they were camping. They were both, flat broke. So Stacy had a 22. They would shoot squirrels and stuff. And they ate well. He said they ate very well that week, or 5 days or whatever it was. Yeah, they camped, and at some point they went to a theater and were watching a movie, and they had alcohol in their drinks. And I don't know if they were being kind of rowdy maybe. And one of them, I think it was Stacy, spilled his drink and it flowed down under the seats, and somebody went and told on him, and they asked him to leave, and he blew his top. And we learned this from the inquest, but he pulled the hat off his head and ripped it in half, over them telling him to leave. It was very out of nowhere, an overreaction. And Red was like, this is my hometown. I don't want any trouble with any of this. Like, I'm fine with leaving. So he did leave. And Stacy ended up getting arrested. He pushed it to the limit where he got arrested. And Red did end up bringing his things out to California for his mother. But as it turns out, it was just a good deed. He's like, I would want somebody to do that for me. So he didn't know anything about Barb. He never heard any mention of, this is how long later, he doesn't recall him ever saying anything about a girl or being in Williston or anything like that. So for me, I went kind of numb. I was like, oh my God, we got absolutely nothing. This was huge. And we really didn't get much at all. We know that he had a normal week up till that point and he snapped, but no mention of Barb. So it was very, it was good, but it was disappointing. It was hard to get over at the time. So yeah, but Red's been very helpful. As far as sharing what he did know about what happened, and unfortunately it wasn't as much as we would have liked. But
yeah, it's great that you were able to connect with him, though. That's really interesting stuff, and the story about Stacy kind of snapping is definitely interesting for that alone. Did the police get a chance to talk to Red?
Yes, actually. I actually reached out to Williston PD and I gave them the information. James didn't. We decided, you know what, we should give police the chance to interview him before, we try to contact him for sure. And I gave that information to them, and I asked multiple times if they were going to follow up with it in a timely manner. And they dodged my question every time. And I was like, I don't know I don't know if they're doing that on purpose or not. And I was worried that we might lose him. I don't know why I really thought that, because he had been there for a while. I didn't know that at the time, though. We didn't actually know that pastor's address, that he was living there. We didn't know that at the time either. So James didn't find that out until he called, because finally I'm like, you know what? Maybe just give him a call. See what happens. Because I wasn't sure how quickly they were going to follow up with it, or if they, even felt like it was a big deal. But also, like I said, we didn't really expect that he lived there and that James would end up talking to Red, within a day. So yeah, the circumstances changed pretty quickly there. But I do believe that law enforcement did talk to him after that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that they were camping together and they ate very well because they were using this 22 to shoot squirrels and eat them. You'd think that they were you'd think that if they were these career criminals and they had a gun, if they had a 22, the first thing I thought you were going to say was they had a 22, so they held up a couple of convenience stores or, did some home invasions.
Yeah, nope, nothing like that. And the reason that we actually asked the questions that led to the answer, knowing that they ate very well, is James actually had kind of a theory about Stacy ahead of that, wondering if maybe he just wanted a free meal and, a warm bed for the night, getting arrested like that for seemingly no reason. So.
Oh, so intentionally.
Yeah, because it almost seems intentional that he threw a fit, to go to jail.
Yeah, like so over the top over something so insignificant. What kind of hat was he wearing? Like, what are we talking here? Like
I'm not sure. They just listed in the inquest. I mean, if it was one of those mesh ones, that'd be easy, but I don't know.
Yeah, interesting though. But then he kills himself right then?
Yeah, they arrest him. They take him to the jail. They give him his, overalls or whatever. He asks for a book. They give him a Western book. He's like really happy. Oh, thanks. I like Westerns. He's in the cell by himself, but there are other people in the jail, and someone kind of talks to him like through the wall or through the bar. And they couldn't see him, but someone talked to him, just asked him, "What are you in for?" Wasn't anything really, no real information. And then he basically, at some point during the night, he hangs himself. He kind of tied his pant legs in a loop, I think, and then there was some kind of vent. I've actually seen photographs, that they would never have, published these photographs of him hanging there anyway. But the judge up there in Malta said, you can look at them in our office, but you can't make copies or anything. But I did get to see them, and he kind of took his pant legs and up through the bars. There was like a air duct or vent that he kind of looped it around, and then he just wasn't really a noose. It was just more, he just looked kind of weird actually the way he did it, but there was no one else there. And, in the morning they found him there. And I guess we should mention that his sister told us also on the podcast that she was the last one to talk to him, and he had called, and we kind of thought maybe he called her from jail, but we're not sure that makes sense now. But he called his sister and say her story is that he said, "Hey sis, I'm coming home." And she says, "Well, when you get here, be careful. I got a new dog and he'll bite you." And he says, "No, that it doesn't matter. The way I'm coming home," something like, "the way I'm coming home, it doesn't matter. Tell mom I love her and I'm sorry for what I did." So we don't know if he's referring to Barbara Cotton's murder or he's just saying, "Tell mom I'm sorry that I killed myself."
Wow, that's quite a tangled web there.
Yeah, and we probably don't want to get off this call without noting that there's another person of interest who also hung himself in jail.
Right. Yeah, tell us about that person. What was their name?
Frank de la Pena, and we got his name from Williston PD in my interview with detectives that, by the way, there's another person of interest. Somewhere in Barbara's file, there someone noted way back in 81 that Wyoming had called to get information on a Frank de la Pena who had just murdered 2 girls in Rawlins, Wyoming. Barbara went missing on the 11th, and this murders were on May 7th, I think. April 11th, and murders in Rawlins, Wyoming were on May 7th. Renee Davidson, 9 years old, and Penny Swanson, 12 years old, just walked to the store to get candy or, ice cream, drugstore kind of thing. And several people had seen, both in Rawlins and in other towns that same day and the day before, I believe, a man driving around with a van, I think, and a trailer, asking people if they wanted to adopt his puppy, if they would just come on inside the van, the trailer to get the puppy, they could have it. And he had tried several times, and unfortunately, it's just terrible. Actually, stopped in Rawlins. Of all the, I'll just have to say this: of all the things I've reported on, in these 9 seasons, the most saddest, I guess, moment I've had to experience, it was stopping in Rawlins, where these girls got kidnapped and were found dead the next morning. This Frank de la Pena murdered them. He was in Williston when Barbara went missing. While they're investigating this case down there in Rawlins, this double homicide, they call up to Williston and like, you have any information on this guy, Frank De La Pena? He's murdered two girls down here. He's a suspect. And someone noted that and put it in Barbara's file. And then years later, just a few years ago, someone came across that. And now he's like, that's a huge red flag, right? And now he is considered a person of interest. As we mentioned earlier, he also was arrested for these murders and hung himself in jail.
So he never really faced justice?
No. Nope, he never went to trial.
He did it before he could be extradited.
I got a hold of all the records down there. There's a handwritten suicide note. In this case, he left a suicide note, and it was the most narcissistic thing. I actually refused to read it in my podcast. I just refused to give this person a platform. You could tell at the time he was even writing notes to media back then. Tell the media this and this. He's trying to control the narrative, and he was almost succeed. I mean, if I had done that, I would have felt like, wow, he actually succeeded, in getting his narrative out there, and I just refused to do it. But obviously, a very sick individual, very narcissistic. And maybe I'll let Lisa Jo talk about what was going on with him up in Williston with his hospital and all that stuff.
Yeah. So he worked for a seismology company. Obviously, well, actually, it's not obvious to everybody. I find out more and more that people don't really understand the significance of this. But in 1981, Williston, North Dakota was experiencing a big oil boom. So we say it like it's like everybody should just know this and it's common knowledge that there was drifters coming through. But I'm catching myself now. But there was an extraordinary amount of drifters from everywhere coming into Williston looking for work in the oil fields. People like Frank De La Pena, for instance. Stacy could have been there trying to find a job in the oil fields. And then the people who had jobs out there, you have the long haul truckers, everything that goes along with it. They saw a rise in prostitution, drugs, all the stuff that comes with an oil boom. So I just wanted to touch on that quickly, but that's why Frank De La Pena was there. He worked seismology in, oil work, and he had been doing that for a while. We know that he also worked in Wyoming. We managed to track down a woman who knew him. He was actually the best man in her wedding. And we found out quite a bit of information from her about him, including that he was married and had a son. She came out to Wyoming for a while with the little boy and then went back to Mexico. So this was stuff that law enforcement had no idea about, that I was able to pass along to them. So sometime after Wyoming, she had lost contact with him. Her and her husband ended up, well, actually at the time of the murders, they were still together, but since then they had divorced. So he worked seismology in Williston. The woman that we found, she was still down in Colorado or Wyoming, somewhere down there, still doing the same kind of work, her and her husband both. De La Pena apparently had some sort of falling out with a coworker. He ended up losing his job over it. When was that, James? When did he lose his job? The end of April?
I think so, yeah. And then he was in the hospital and got out of the hospital on May 2nd.
So he lost his job and within a few days was admitted into the hospital. Our understanding is that it was psychiatric reasons. He explained a pressure in his head and things like that. And then he was discharged, and he actually had a camper at a KOA there in Williston that he lived in, and he pulled it with a van. So we know that he was at the KOA for a couple days after he left the hospital, and then he headed south, traveling to Wyoming. So we don't know obviously what happened in those few days, or why specifically he was in the hospital, but it's curious. We built a timeline on all that stuff, and it's very odd. Actually, you know what? Something else I found that I was able to pass along to police is that I think it was a couple years prior to him being in Williston. But he was arrested for, I think it was first-degree sexual assault. I got no details on it. All I got is the date that he was arrested. They didn't have anything else because, it would have been probably it was in the 70s. I'm surprised they even had that. But I did find that. I think that was in Missouri. Beyond that, there's not anything that suggests that he had done anything. I mean, that obviously is along potential lines, but according to this friend, he that boy was his world. She couldn't believe it. In fact, she couldn't believe it to the point where when they figured out who this guy was, she was like, and they're flashing his picture on TV and stuff to get him arrested. She thought there wasn't a chance it could be him. No way. So she had photos of him from their wedding and things like that. Basically, she tried to call law enforcement and talk to them, and the dispatcher wouldn't let her through. Like, yeah, lady, and hung up. So she's like, hindsight, this is a terrible idea, and I can't believe I did this. She called there and said, I know where he's at. And they showed up at her house, or like the motel they were, guns drawn. Like, she's like, oh, maybe I went too far. But she really wanted to talk to somebody. And I'm like, well, it worked. I mean, it did. So then, they kept her there all night. They're interrogating her. She had explained, like, look, I tried to get a hold of you guys. I have these pictures of him. I think you guys are wrong about this. But they kept her there all night, interrogating her. And by the end of it, she did understand that, oh, he must have done this. He absolutely did do this. They have proof that he did this, but just going into it. But at the same time, the randomness of what he did, James had mentioned that he tried to pick up multiple people along the way before he was successful, unfortunately. He tried to pick up a little boy. He tried to pick up an adult woman. Kids, it's like it didn't matter. There wasn't anything specific he was necessarily looking for. Impulsive. I don't know.
Right. Okay. And so these were people that he saw on the side of the road, essentially, sort of by chance. Okay. So that's interesting when looking at Barbara's case, because did she also do some hitchhiking?
I haven't heard any stories of her doing that, but that's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. She's, from what I know of her, she's trusting enough that I feel like that's very much a possibility.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And what do you make of this, I guess, sort of hunger strike that he performed when he was incarcerated?
Wow, you've done your research. I kind of forgot about that. I don't know what that was about, really. Like, I think maybe he was going to starve himself to death instead of hanging himself or something. I actually don't know.
Well, he said he doesn't deserve to eat after what he did. There's obviously some mental health issues going on there. Maybe he'd bounce back to feeling terrible. Or maybe it was manipulating the media. It's hard to say. I could go either way. Yeah, maybe he had times where he realized what he had done and felt bad about it. I have no idea.
And how old was De La Pena at that point?
He was older. I want to say 35.
Sounds right to me. Something like that.
About 35?
Yeah. And we have obviously speculated and thought, did, Stacy Werder and De La Pena cross paths in Williston? Did they know each other? This thing that they both hang themselves in jail. First De La Pena, and then Stacy a couple months later, same year that she goes missing. We speculated, right? Like, did they have a suicide pact? Were they both involved in her disappearance? It's kind of crazy that two of the persons of interest hung themselves in jail. I don't know how common that was, but yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that not eating business because, Lisa Jo, you had said that he would pick up anybody and it seemed like a compulsion. And that kind of struck me like maybe he did go through these waves of guilt, and that was a way to, I don't know, not punish himself, but cleanse himself maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Detox.
Hard to say.
Yeah. I guess we should mention that like the last episode I produced, I believe, for this story is a gal who named Jerry up in Williston who claims or believes she saw Barbara Cotton after she went missing, and it was at the hospital in Williston, and she thought it was, 2 or 3 weeks after anyone'd seen her. And I'll just say this about Jerry. I know that she believes she saw Barbara Cotton. This is not a person I've interviewed who's looking for attention. If anything, she's told this story since way back when. What happened was she went to the police in Williston when she saw Barbara, or thought she saw Barbara, and she was basically chewed out by the chief of police for, how dare you come in here making up stories or something. And we're talking, within a few weeks of Barbara going missing. But I've just found it interesting. You can't help because you lay awake at night thinking about these cases. And so we have De La Pena going to the hospital within 2 or 3 weeks after Barbara going missing. And then this one person being completely convinced they saw Barbara Cotton at that hospital, a few weeks after. When I'm laying in bed thinking about this, it's like, did Barbara know De La Pena? Did Stacy know De La Pena? One of the last things anyone knows about Barbara, she was going to help a friend take a dog to the vet. There's this theme of dogs in this story that just won't leave me alone from the beginning. And I don't know, you lay awake at night just trying to put these pieces of a puzzle together without even knowing what the puzzle's supposed to look like.
Well, Lisa Jo, what's next in your search for Barbara?
So recently, I got a hold of a team of people, Light the Way, that advocate for missing people. So I'm excited about that. Help get Barb's story out there more, and they seem like they're really awesome. And I think you guys know them as well.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that. I mean, it's not like when James was covering this story. He said it, I think, on the last episode that he did with you guys, that he figured he'd do a couple episodes and that would be that. Everything's out there, whatnot. And he just experienced such a mountain of information coming at him from people that felt that they had no outlet. And that's why there's 20 episodes. And it's not like that now. Obviously, information slows down. I still get people who email me, and unfortunately it's stuff that I can't share. They've asked me not to, but I look into it and I try to get them in contact with law enforcement, which has worked so far. I haven't had anybody, turn that down, but, yeah, so, even though it seems like there's nothing going on, there's usually at least some iron in the fire somewhere. But yeah, and I also help out with other cases, which I always credit Barb for, because I'd just be finding adoptees, not missing people. So, I have to credit her for bringing me onto this path that I suddenly found myself on. So
I know, I gotta just say, I know what I think needs to be done on this case, and that is that Lisa Jo and maybe a couple other people who knew Barb get access to the complete police file and read it from beginning to end. I mean, I know a lot of law enforcement have read through it, but it's been 42 years now, and I don't know what possible harm could come from letting someone like Lisa Jo go through that whole file. That's what I think should happen, but
I wouldn't mind.